Hi, I'm Elisabeth Belliveau. I'm the author of Birth Story, and this is the True North Country Comics podcast.
Welcome to the True North Country Comics podcast, dedicated to celebrate Canadian comic book and graphic novel creators and supporters. I'm John Swinimer. On this episode, I chat with Elisabeth Belliveau about her graphic memoir, Birth Story, published by Conundrum Press. Please like and subscribe to this website by hitting the subscribe button so you'll be notified about new podcast interviews and article posts. This podcast is available wherever podcasts are enjoyed. Please like, follow, and subscribe. Hailing from Antigonish, Nova Scotia, Elisabeth Belliveau holds a BFA from AU Arts and Sculpture and an MFA in Studio Arts from Concordia University. Her studio is now based in Treaty 6, Edmonton, where she's an Associate Professor of Studio Arts at MacEwan University, serving as guest faculty at Banff Center for the Arts in 2025. Elisabeth's professional highlights include exhibitions with MOMENTA International Biennale of Art, the Canadian Embassy in Tokyo, animation screenings at the Irish Film Institute, and Studio 44 in Stockholm. She's attended numerous residencies, including the National Film Board of Canada, Banff Center, Women's Studio Workshop in New York, Struts Gallery in New Brunswick, KIAC Yukon, Ravi Belgium, and most recently Arts Itoya in Japan. Her current exhibition, Wayfinders, a constellation of women artists, curated by Lindsey Sharman, is at the Art Gallery of Alberta until May 31st. Previously, Elisabeth published her graphic novel Condolady with Conundrum Press in 2022. Her latest graphic memoir, again published by Conundrum Press, is entitled Birth Story. Birth Story is a graphic memoir about pregnancy, birth, postpartum depression, and new motherhood as an artist. It explores the physical and psychologically altering birth process, pain, transformation, trauma, healing, and the window of time around the birthing body. Struggling to find representations of birth and postpartum depression in popular culture and art, the author interweaves other stories, friendship, and travel to help make sense of it all. This personal birth story is an effort to remember and contribute to sharing strength in all women's voices. So, without further ado, here's my chat with Elisabeth Belliveau about her graphic memoir, Birth Story, published by Conundrum Press. So, Elisabeth Belliveau, thank you very much for taking time to chat with me.
Great. Well, thanks so much for inviting me, John. This is exciting.
Well, I appreciate your time in talking about comic books, graphic novels, especially graphic memoirs. But before we get to all that, I would like to know, what was the first comic book that you read?
Oh, yeah. The first comic book I read, I think when I was a child, obviously Archie's. But as an adult, Julie Doucette, my New York Diary, was 100% and still is the most influential graphic novel comic I've ever read, and definitely my favorite and the first.
So is there anyone today, like you mentioned, Julie, is there any other creators today or influences today?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, for sure, Teresa Wong's Dear Scarlet was a big influence, and especially writing the book I just launched. But I don't actually read a lot of graphic novels and comics. I think as maybe I'm also an artist, and I seem to veer away from work that I do and get influences from outside of that. So I'd say that I'm more influenced by fiction writing and poetry. I read graphic novels and comics very sparingly.
Are there any particular artists or novelists that have inspired you lately or sort of tickled your fancy?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for writing Birth Story and kind of this period of my life, I was really grateful for other people's books that addressed some of the issues I was working through. So thinking about postpartum depression and birth, some of the fiction writers I really valued would be Rachel Cusk, her book A Life's Work, Olga Ravin, her book My Work, Sylvia Molnar's book The Nursery, and probably kind of more, I guess, biographical books like Baby on the Fire Escape by Julie Phillips, which is like a collection of stories about women, artists, birthing parents, and activists, and how they sort of navigated parenthood and the early years after birth.
So we're here talking about your latest graphic novel, which is a graphic memoir entitled Birth Story.
And it is about you, but how would you summarize the book to someone?
A quick summary. Often I end up sharing this when I'm in the park with my kid and someone asks about it. And I usually just say it's a bit of a bummer. It's about birth and postpartum depression. But the longer description is that it's a book about seeking images of pregnancy and child loss and birth and postpartum depression and trying to look for images about that through art. And as a person who was going through all these things, I was really needing images and models of these experiences. And I'm a very visual thinker. So, navigating the world as an artist, I was very surprised at the lack of images of these life creating and life altering events. So, my book, Birth Story, tries to make sense of my experience while pointing out books, art, and people and places that supported me. And a lot of people will tell me that the book does have moments of humor and that it is not a total bummer. But I think that's probably how I would describe the book.
Now, you mentioned that you were reading some fiction or nonfiction novels prior to get some inspiration. Is your graphic memoir sort of a first in this category?
For me, it is, but I have come across, Teresa Wong's book, Dear Scarlet, is an amazing work that addresses postpartum depression. There is a book called Postpartum Me by Conundrum Press that also does a really excellent job talking about kind of parenting and postpartum depression as well. So I've been finding these books, but I wasn't aware of them until I was trying to figure out my own situation and make my work. So those books and those resources are out there. It just took me a while to find them. And it really helped guide my work, my project.
Is there any particular message that you hope readers take away after getting through your graphic memoir?
Yeah, for sure. I think I felt really alone and very unprepared for birth and early motherhood, parenthood, and the recovery involved. And I was quite ill, so it was hard for me to talk about what I was going through and how to kind of ask for the help I needed. So ultimately, I really hope sharing my birth story helps other birthing parents and people who care for birthing parents to feel a little bit less alone and to lift some of the taboos about talking about these experiences. And there were simple things like, as a visual thinker and an artist, wanting to visualize the experience and prepare myself for things that, you really actually can't prepare yourself for parenthood or birth. But I was always seeking images or stories about how it goes down. Like even, for instance, the moment of crowning, when it's a stage of labor, when the baby's head becomes visible at the vaginal opening, like really like things like that seem very universal and very important. And I couldn't really find those sorts of images. So I think my book, I tried really hard to illustrate that and to try to describe the pain as best I could as a visual thinker. These are kinds of questions and curiosities I had that I didn't really find satisfying answers or guides for. So yeah, I think my book was trying to tackle some of that. And I was also just very confused about how something so universal could be so hard to access. And I guess trying to visually explain the sequence of events and what it looked like from my perspective, I really hope that that might be useful to someone who's also curious or feels kind of alone or unprepared for this kind of experience. And again, my experience was my own unique experience. Everyone's is very different, but I feel like sharing birth stories and bringing them together kind of dispels some of the fear or mystery or kind of taboos about talking about the things that can happen.
I know a lot of would-be parents or expecting often get the book, What to Expect When You're Expecting, which is sort of like a generic all-encompassing, but I guess it doesn't give you the first-person perspective that you provide.
Yeah, every birth story is totally unique. And the more people share their stories with me, there is no template for how this happens. And even like leading up to birth and the recovery and postpartum, and every minute and every day is different for every person. So I feel like, yeah, the prenatal classes and all those things are great, but they can't cover everything. So I'm hoping to offer some way to kind of fill the gap of like how this experience can possibly happen for someone.
I'd like to switch gears a wee bit now and talk about the tools you used to create your book. You're a multidisciplinary artist, so I'd like to ask you, how did you make your book?
Well, basically, it's India ink and drawing ink, little tiny paintbrushes, and Arches cold press paper. I did all the drawings, scanned them, and then I made my own hand painted font and added the text to the drawings afterwards in Photoshop. And that was it. It was really simple, basic tools.
Typically in most comic books and graphic novels, there's a script that you write, but were you just going based on memory? You said, okay, now we're going to do this and this and this along the way, sort of a timeline, or how did it work out for you?
Well, I started doing the drawings when I was pregnant as a way to understand my changing body. I was really compelled to draw it because drawing is kind of a form of thinking for me and understanding. So I had no plan. And actually, a good friend of mine had her baby about 3 months before I had mine. And she called and told me her birth story. And this is during lockdown and COVID. So we were talking on the phone and quite alone. We couldn't see people and, everyone was masked. And so she called me and said she was really afraid of forgetting, as we are all told that we will as new parents. She was afraid of forgetting her birth story. So she wanted to put the story somewhere. And so she kind of just told me the entire story over the course of probably an hour. And her experience was really traumatic. And she's a very strong person. So hearing that she had endured all of that and hearing her baby crying in the background and knowing everyone was safe and she was already breastfeeding, it really floored me. And it was really hard to imagine someone I admire who's a very powerful artist to having gone through so much suffering. So I was really honored to hear all of that and felt the power of sharing a birth story and the desire to remember it. So I wanted to remember my own birth story and plan to work through that in a book form from that point. And I had to lean on photos that I took. I knew that memory would be kind of different because you're exhausted. And for me, there was a lot of trauma that happened. So I leaned a lot on photos that I took and photos that my partner, Kelly McLean, took over about 3 years that the graphic novel covers. I had to restage a few things and go to different places to kind of get the images I wanted. But I worked on it when I could between having a full-time job and parenting and recovery and life things. So the bulk of it came together during my sabbatical when I was at a residency at Arts Itoya in Japan. And my 2-year-old and my partner, Kelly, were able to join me there. So I got a lot of work done while being part of my family. And I was able to send the files to my first readers. And my first readers were Marigold Santos, who's an amazing artist and painter in Mohkinstsis, Calgary, and Geneviève Lebleu, who's a graphic novel maker in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, and Slinko, who's an amazing artist in New Jersey. And Slinko actually printed off the entire book and then wrote and scribbled post-it notes and put them all on the photocopies and then mailed them physically back to me with her edits. So that was incredible. And I finished the whole book in my studio that's in my backyard. And that was sort of it. It took about 3 years with about a year-long break in the middle where there was a lot of recovery and the early year of parenting. And so when my child was able to go to daycare and I was back to work full-time, there was a bit of rhythm and stability, and I was able to get the work done.
So I mentioned before you're a multidisciplinary artist. I'm wondering, what media do you prefer as the most satisfying as a creator?
Well, right now I'm making sculptural mobiles in my studio, and that involves casting cement and learning about metal smithing. And I'd say that right now that's what I'm really engaged in. But for about 20 years now, I've had a rotation of working on sculptures and then finishing a body of work and then changing over and making stop motion animation. And when that's done, going back to graphic novels and zines. So I kind of work in those 3 ways and move between them. And it's a really good balance because sculpture is really physical and I'm on my feet and using materials and my body. Drawing the graphic novels and zines kind of brings me more into my mind and writing and drawing. And it's easier on my body in some ways, and easier on my eyes compared to the animation, which with stop motion animation, I'm on a computer and barely moving for months and months and months. So that really wears me down. So having those 3 different practices is physically really helpful, but also just kind of uses different parts of my mind and body. So I move between those 3 practices.
Is sculpture or that type of work more satisfying because it's more immediate than making a graphic novel, which, as you said, can take years and years?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sculpture can be very immediate and it is so rewarding. But then the kind of, I guess the longest work that I do is my stop motion animations. Those are very long. Those are big commitments. So making a quick zine feels really great. And then working on a larger project like a graphic novel. It's great to see how when you create a graphic novel, a lot of people can become involved, and also distribution, having a publisher and having multiple copies means it has a wider audience. So they have different durations in terms of process, but they also have different access for who gets to engage with it when it's completed and what communities it connects with.
So reading your bio, I noted that you're a teacher. So I've got to ask you then, what is the one piece of advice you'd like to pass along to someone who's planning their own graphic memoir?
I'm going to share 3 pieces of advice that I would give and then one that I got that I really appreciate. So my advice is don't wait. seek feedback and learn from it. And the last one is the most important, which is finish it. It's very simple. And then the advice I got from a wonderful friend and artist and bookmaker named Jess McCormick, once they gave me feedback on an animation I was making, and all they said was just make it weirder. And I think that's the best advice I've ever received.
What does that mean, weirder, though? Like, is it beyond the norm? Is it beyond what people would expect you to make? I'm a little confused by that.
I think what they meant was push it further, don't hold back, and that there's lots of space and permission to explore. So I think that permission and that invitation to make it weirder led me to feel more freedom to be creative, experiment, and that there was space for my weirdness or my making something that I didn't know about or hadn't seen before. And that's, I think, what makes the work stronger for me. So, yeah.
Now that you've got the book out and published, do you have any events planned to promote your graphic novel?
For sure. I just want to mention I did have my first launch a few weeks ago at Paper Birch Books here in Amisquachiwaskigan, Edmonton. And it was held in conversation with Michelle Campos Castillo, who's a graphic novelist and artist here. And she designed my book. And I was also in conversation with Abby LaSalle, a feminist writer and researcher and PhD candidate at U of T. And it was my absolute favorite evening in the best company. And one of the things I learned was doing a book launch for a graphic novel can be really challenging because there's not, in my work, not a ton of text, and the images are super heavy. So having people in conversation around the book and kind of bringing the conversation out between the three of us was incredible and rewarding. And I had a great space at Paper Birch. So that was a few weeks ago. Next up, I'll be at Variant Editions for Independent Bookstore Day, which is Sunday, April 26th. And then I will be going to Montreal Comic Arts Festival in May, and then Toronto Comic Arts Festival in June with Conundrum Press to do signings and participate in both of those festivals.
Very good. Sounds like you'll be busy.
Yeah.
So what's next? I know that you're working on a variety of different art projects, and Birth Story is your latest graphic memoir. Do you have anything underway that might fit in that category?
I'm taking a breath right now. I have an exhibition up at the Art Gallery of Alberta called Wayfinders with other artists in the city, and I'm pretty excited about that. It's up until the end of May. Birth Story just launched. I'm kind of secretly hoping to finish a little zine that I can bring along to share at MCAF and TCAF. But other than that, I'll probably just be preparing for teaching in the fall and practicing my sculpture techniques in the studio.
Well, with everything that you have on the go today and in the future, where do you recommend that people go online to find out more about you?
You can search my name, Elisabeth Belliveau, Elizabeth with an S and Belliveau with 2 L's. And it's easy to find me on Instagram, Vimeo, and I do have a website. Or you can just go to Conundrum Press and that'll connect to me and you can order books there.
Well, Elisabeth, those are all the questions I have for you, but I'm wondering, is there something I didn't ask that you'd like to get across in this interview?
I would maybe just want to go back to the beginning and just stress again how valuable it was to find other people's work that talked about birth and postpartum, and reading a lot of the works that I mentioned earlier, being very grateful that these other writers had made so much space to feel safe and feel those feelings. And it really was a lifeline to know other people had been through this and that they were able to find health and love and share their experiences. And I feel like a lot of the books I did come across were really dense and really heavily reading focused. And one of the strange things about postpartum was my eyesight changed. And I think for a lot of birthing parents, it does affect your eyes and concentration. So it was really hard for me to read in the first couple of years after having a child. So I feel there's a lot of space for graphic novels and that they offer images. It's a different kind of access point for sharing stories and a different kind of visual communication and storytelling. So I was really interested in exploring that. Also, I was way more rooted in my body than in my mind the first few years. So being able to visually explore experience through images rather than words was really helpful for me. So yeah, I guess that's one thing I just wanted to point out was that other writers made safe space for me to explore this. And I think graphic novels made a really helpful space to think about that experience without leaning too heavily on language that's based in text.
Thanks to Elisabeth for the chat. You can discover more about Elisabeth Belliveau online at elizabeth-belliveau.com and on Instagram at Elisabeth Belliveau. You can discover more about Birth Story at conundrumpress.com. And thank you for tuning in to the True North Country Comics podcast. I invite you to visit the True North Country Comics website to listen to even more conversations with creators about making comic books and graphic novels. I also encourage you to subscribe via the website to be notified about new podcast interviews and article posts. This podcast is available wherever podcasts are enjoyed. Please like, follow, and subscribe. You can follow along True North Country Comics on most social media platforms, and you're encouraged to send any and all feedback to John at truenorthcountrycomics.com. Thanks for tuning in. Come back soon for another episode. Bye for now. True North Country Comics Podcast is copyright True North Country Comics, copyright 2026.